I want to begin by welcoming you all and saying how thrilled I am that we are back for another season. This is the beginning of our 24-25 speaker series season. The Conversations Across Screen Cultures series is a collaboratively produced speaker series that creates space for dynamic conversations among screen studies scholars, practitioners, programmers, and artists. Sessions feature open discussion and dialogue between speakers and attendees. Begun by Patty Zimmermann during the pandemic lockdown, Conversations Across Screen Cultures honors Patty's legacy by promoting connection and collaboration as critical modes for screen studies practice. Ithaca, New York, where this series began, is located on the traditional homelands of the Gyokano, the Cayuga Nation. The Gyokano are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. We acknowledge the painful history of Gyokano dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gyokano people, past and present, to these lands and waters. We want to welcome all guests to our event this evening. I am Leah Schaefer, one of the co-conveners and producers of this series, and I'm going to introduce our conversationalists for the evening and describe the structure of our events. The format for the evening is this. We will begin with a half-hour conversation between this evening's featured screen scholars. Then we're going to open to discussion with you. The theme of our speaker series is conversations, so we are really hoping that you will want to talk with us. The way that we invite you to speak with us is we ask you to raise your human hand, and then we will call on you. After we have the 30 minutes of conversation between the speakers and then a Q&A, we like to wrap up the event by sharing takeaways. So we will ask everyone to switch into gallery view so we can see each other, and then we will all share our thoughts about something we learned or something we found interesting that happened during the conversation this evening. After that, at 8 o'clock, we hold something that we call Connections and Locations. Connections and Locations is a sort of after party where folks are invited to linger and chat about the ideas raised in our conversations the evening throughout. So that is the structure of our event. Our featured speaker this evening is Marina Hassapopoulou. She is assistant professor in the Martin Scorsese Department of Cinema Studies at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Dr. Hassapopoulou will be interviewed by Dr. Barbara Mennel. Dr. Mennel is a professor of film studies and German studies in the departments of English and languages, literatures, and cultures at the University of Florida. I want to thank both of them very much for being here this evening, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing their conversation. Thanks so much, everyone.
So I'm going to start with thanking Leah and the team of Conversations Across the Screens for inviting me to interview Marina Hassapopoulou because I was actually on her dissertation committee. And so now I read her book that just came out in 2024, and I want to mention the title again because there are some important conceptual changes since the dissertation, and I think every word in the title matters. So it is called Interactive Cinema, The Ambiguous Ethics of Media Participation. And so I want to say that often as scholars, we don't really read the dissertation and the book on the same topic because we assume if we read the dissertation, we know what the book will say, or if we read the book, we don't need to read the dissertation. And it was a real treat to see how the book intensifies and clarifies and expands the topics and the argument of the dissertation. And it gave me a lot of trust in dissertations, that people have sort of the right idea, but then they really need that time to work it out in more depth than they can do so at that moment of the dissertation. And so I wanted to start with a somewhat simple question, and that is, how did you end up with the topic of interactive cinema? How did you come to it? What were your thoughts?
You mean in graduate school? Yes. Well, I've always been fascinated by forms of cinema that didn't quite fit into existing canons, existing versions of film history. So it kind of started with a fascination with, let's say, distributed forms of cinema across different galleries, museums, web-based forms of cinema. Flash was still really big when I was in grad school. And I was just thinking, wow, these examples really, on the one hand, expand the idea of cinema, because, by the way, I was also interested in expanded cinema. But they pose a real challenge to theorizing cinema. They pose challenges to unified idea or impression of cinema. So I kind of wanted to take on that challenge of writing about this rather marginalized forms of cinema. But as Barbara knows, the initial stage of writing was much more chaotic, I would say, because also there were not many precedents to writing about this, especially from within the field of film and media studies. And if you read the book now, I wanted to incorporate, for instance, the work of artist practitioners. Some might be joining us today that are featured in the book. I wanted to include other modes of scholarship, such as multimedia scholarship from one of the first multimedia journals, Vectors, that started at USC. I wanted to include manifestos. I wanted to incorporate other modalities that are usually undermined when we think of cinema, like smell and taste and disability, human and beyond human ideas of cinema, cross-cultural notions, and so on. But really, I feel like the book took shape after the dissertation. As Barbara, you point out, the dissertation for me was an important testing ground. It was very overwhelming to write, but I knew there was something there. But I will say the arguments really took a sharper shape post-dissertation. But I really loved how my committee, which was very interdisciplinary, that included professors from film studies. Also, Barbara has extensive knowledge of transnational cinema. I had an artist, so they were from different backgrounds, and I feel like that really helped me incorporate multiple disciplines and multiple forms of cinema, and they were all very welcoming to this topic. So yes.
Do you want to just tell those in the audience who may not have an idea of interactive cinema what it is? What is interactive cinema?
Yes, so that is the question, right? So there are, as you read the book, each chapter is organized around a different notion of interactivity, okay? So typically interactive cinema actively incorporates the audience into the construction of the cinematic experience. For instance, in the book, I go back to rebus films from Weimar Germany in the 20s that were crossword puzzle films. So the audience were encouraged to solve riddles, literally cinematic riddles, and they would fill out a crossword puzzle card. Then I also talk about some of the first choose your own adventure feature-length films, including the Czechoslovakian film Kino Automat, that incorporated the audience in the form of majority vote into determining the outcome of the narrative, supposedly, right? And then the book also moves to other forms of interactivity that have to do with software-generated cinema. There's a little bit about AI, though I didn't want to make it all about the new, so-called new. So I talk a little bit about interactive documentaries. It's a plural term, and it is very generative, even though it might seem quite broad, right? So that's why I use specific chapters to introduce different forms of participation.
I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about why you insist on the term cinema and how you differentiate that from other forms of interaction now with new media, computer games, video games. So what is at stake for you to insist on the term cinema?
Yes, I will say even with the title, I really pushed to retain cinema in the title because the book came out as part of the iconic electronic mediation series by the University of Minnesota Press. And when I was a student, I read a lot of those books. Actually, the bibliography, I think, is partially heavily dominated by some of those books because they were very formative during my studies. And I wanted to show that cinema, film studies can really offer a lot to newer and emerging fields such as digital studies, digital humanities, and so on, because sometimes there tends to be this notion that cinema studies is stuck within particular historical and material moments. And I did not want to perpetuate those ideas. So I would say I take a more apparatus agnostic approach because I want to bring in theories from other fields such as art history, museum studies, performance studies, video game studies, and bring them into the conversation about cinema. So then the more interdisciplinary the study of cinema becomes, the more elusive the idea of cinema is, right? So beyond its institutional specificity, cinema could mean a lot of things. The cinematic could be anywhere. So I just kind of wanted to play around with the different variations. So it was very important to retain cinema and make it part of the electronic mediations series.
Oh, wow. Sorry. I wonder whether you would want to tell us a little bit more about maybe one example of an interactive cinema for those who maybe can't imagine how does it work for audience participation, and maybe thinking about from our contemporary perspective, is it different than a video game? Is it different than a computer game? Is there qualitative difference, or is it a historical development?
I would say it really varies because the book cuts across various cultural contexts, across various materialities. I don't know if it's a good time to show something.
Yeah, maybe show one example.
Yes, so I already mentioned a few. Sorry. Okay, so because in other events that I've done related to the book, I talk about other things. So I'm trying to mention something new. So I'm going to talk about CD-ROM and DVD-ROM media arts as forms of interactive cinema, because apart from earlier historical periods that are covered in the book, there is also an emphasis, and I feel like one of the most unique contributions of the book, of interactive cinema as a part of the CD, DVD-ROM, disc-based modes of interaction. So one very quirky example that I use when I teach disc-based forms of interactive cinema is Masaki Fujihata's Impalpability, which it started out as a CD-ROM that asked computer users to, I don't know if you can see this. Okay, sorry, I did not. To flip over the mouse and to use the ball of the mouse to manipulate the virtual balls that you see on the screen that actually correspond to, most of them, distortions of virtualized skin. Okay. And so it creates this kind of haptic mode of interactivity, and this very interesting kind of, it puts the user and the screen on this kind of tactile spectrum. And this is one of those experiments that took place in the late 90s. So particularly the first chapter of the book on sense and interactivity deals a lot with some of these nearly ephemeral CD-ROM and DVD-ROM experiments and some flash-based works, because at that time, interactivity as a toolkit for many artists was like a sandbox. There were no specific ideologies apart from the corporate buzzwords or the hype associated with interactive video games, VCR, and so on. So artists could more freely experiment in some ways. So Masaki Fujihara's impalpability is sort of an existentialist and embodied reflection on what it means to be digital in this earlier era of electronic art. So probably not what you expected me to mention, since I mentioned before the crossword puzzles and choose your own adventure films. But I do want to mention this because in other events, unfortunately, I forget to mention the CD-ROM and the DVD-ROM examples that are more interactive on a one-on-one basis. So yes. And another variant that we might think is now new, but it's not really. I talk about software-generated films from the early 2000s. In particular, Andreas Kratky and Lev Manovich's soft cinema experiments that started out as installations. I saw a version at the ZKM museum decades ago, and then they ended up on a DVD, right? And those were experiments to see whether narrative and database can actually be reconciled to create new forms of cinema. And contrary to popular belief and even some exclusion within film studies, I find those early examples, the software-generated examples, very interesting. And again, contrary to popular belief, the human is at the core of the exploration rather than something abstractly, post-human that we use it so freely now. They deal with, for instance, post-Cold War immigrants. What does it mean to be a unique individual in the era of fragmentation through globalization, feeling alone everywhere in the world? What does it mean to be a global outcast and so on? So at the core of those early experiments are human concerns, which I really like. And so a lot of these earlier experiments with interactive, for instance, CD-ROMs, with software-generated films, with even so-called prehistoric forms of AI from the early 2000s, I still find them to be very, very sophisticated, very nuanced, and the issues that they grapple with are even more relevant now. Mm-hmm. And I am very challenged to find examples that are more recent, that take advantage of all the new affordances of technology that are actually more thought-provoking, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be great to spotlight various of those interactive instances, mm-hmm. including software and hardware interactivity.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, I mean, reading your book, there's more to explore, so everybody can pick it up. And I think it's very clear that you're offering us an archive, sort of a prehistory to the technological moment that we're in. But I do want to ask another more maybe a workshop kind of question for those who are here. And you mentioned ephemeral installations. How did you find all these examples? How did you manage to actually see all of them? What were challenges?
Yes, that's a really good question. And you probably noticed since the dissertation, the scope has expanded exponentially because, as a graduate student, a lot of it was secondhand. I was, of course, I had limited funding to visit specific museums, and there were very few new media museums. So the ZKM in Karlsruhe, Germany was one of my most inspiring trips, I would say. And they had this big exhibition on the user. So I did a lot of my field work there. Others, it was just kind of collecting DVDs, collecting CD-ROM. Now, at the time, computers still had the embedded disk drive, right? Which now, it was something that I took for granted. So I could play all of these now ephemeral formats on my computer. So I would just collect anything that was labeled interactive out of curiosity, even the ones that were censored, that were taboo. I was just very curious. And I think that's an important part of the dissertation stage, to be curious, not to put too much pressure on coming up with comprehensive conclusions at that stage. And then as I was writing the book, I do mention it's not supposed to be a comprehensive overview of all these interactive media arts practices. Sometimes it's through process of elimination, or what was I able to access personally, what inspired me to generate new insights rather than just recycle things through new media history, let's say, and so on. And then, of course, moving to New York and having more resources through NYU, I was really pushing myself to come up with a broader cross-cultural range. So that's how some films, such as the Taiwanese Choose Your recombinatory film Blue Moon, through the Taiwanese Cultural Institute, came about. I didn't know that in Taiwan there were some interactive films at the turn of the century. So it gave me an incentive to study more of that transitional phase of Taiwanese history to democracy at the time. And are those films symptomatic of particular socio-political and historical transitions? Or are they actually active modes of trying to grapple with those transitions, to negotiate between different modalities, different aesthetics, to even negotiate between the digital and the analog, the human and the post-human, and so on? Yes. So as I mentioned in the book, it started out as a scavenger hunt of whatever I could find. And luckily, Kino Automat had just come out at the time on DVD. So that became a central case study. But now, thanks to also my department's moving image archiving and preservation program, I have broader access to emulators of old discs. We have a growing collection. We have input from other countries, such as Australia, which I felt was very underrated in global discussions of interactive cinema. So I wanted to add Australia to the conversation, particularly through Shock in the Ear, which is one of the most sophisticated cases of interactive sound, where many artists at the time in the late 90s were focused more on tactility and other aspects. Shock in the Ear creates a very complex, very disturbing soundscape that is interactive. So, yes. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it's a lot. So in your book, one of the aspects that I found striking in your writing, and for those of you who are listening and haven't read the book, you can imagine that Marina is a very sophisticated theorist. But almost every time you talk about the actual text, you have a personal voice and you use I, and you reflect on your personal experience of interactivity. And I wondered how much that was an intentional methodology or whether that was something that you weren't aware of. And I found that really striking in terms of methodology, of combining this very sophisticated, theoretical, broad concerns with an account of the experience as the individual user, and sometimes also your students. That was interesting too, where you in the Stockholm example, where you reflect also not just on your experience, but on the collective experience. So if you could just address that fluidity of the approach, or this integration of the approach.
Yes, I would say it was definitely very much intentional, because, again, to go back to the dissertation stage, I think during the dissertation stage, many students have a crisis of meaning. What am I doing? What's the purpose? Do I have an argument in my dissertation? How do I find my own voice? Because you are reading so much and you're trying to create a literature review. So it's very easy for your voice to get drowned. And I felt that some of the discussions and the discourse on interactivity that also overlaps sometimes with video games, for instance, tends to be very ironically impersonal, and sometimes even strives to be objective, whatever that means. So for me, it was very important to include my own subjective encounters, to also incorporate empirical observations from screenings with my students in order to make some, let's say, highbrow theories like object-oriented ontology more accessible to the so-called average reader, right? So I didn't want my book to be this kind of inaccessible academic object, right? Because I was already thinking of it as it's going to be a textbook. I want to use it for my classes. I want my students to personally relate to it. And also, I want to say that theory can be many different things, including open-ended, non-conclusive, highly personal. So I was very inspired by audience reception studies, particularly Judith Main, and who use the eye a lot. And again, when I was a graduate student, audience reception studies was not a big field. It's still pretty much developing, I would say. And fandom studies also, where the personal becomes part of the theory. So I was very inspired by those rather marginalized or secondary subfields. And the other thing that was very important to me, and it was part of this crisis of meaning, was I didn't want my book to alienate people who had not experienced those forms of interactive cinema. So how do we do that? Because oftentimes, I hate to say it, but I experienced that as a student, scholarship can be kind of top down. It's you have the expert and they're describing really obscure forms of cinema. And it's kind of like, you had to be there. Take my word for it, right? So for me, I thought, what would be a more realistic, flexible, adaptable methodology? So then we can actually bring in the reader in interactive ways, let's say.
Thank you. We're going to come to an end of the discussion of the book. And for those of you who don't know Marina's other work, she's also published a lot of articles. She's also won an award by the Society for Cinema and Media Studies for her teaching. And her theoretical work or her concept of the fields also influences her pedagogy in the classroom, but also her publications about pedagogy. But before we shift, I did want to ask you a big question. As you know, as I said already, you intentionally named your book Interactive Cinema, but you also publish in Digital Humanities. It's obvious from your descriptions that you're engaging with new media studies, with AI. You're interested in AI and the archive. So I wonder whether you could map out these intersecting fields for us, how you see them, cinema, media studies, digital humanities. What are fields? What are subfields? What's changing? Where do you stand? This is a big question, sorry, but if you could sort of give us a sense of how you see it at this moment.
Yes. Well, first of all, just creating the book was supposed to be a map of all these fields that sometimes don't intersect as much as I would like them to. Now, what I think are the unique contributions of film and media studies to the digital humanities interdisciplinary arena are if we can, so through film practices, for instance, with prehistoric forms of AI, prehistoric forms of, I'm saying prehistoric, like non-historicized forms of software generated cinema. Now, film studies can actually provide that historiography that sometimes digital humanities or the computational humanities is unaware of, I will say. And so that's why also I wanted to go beyond the binaries normally attached to interactivity as either user manipulation or as a tool for empowerment, because those also limit the social histories of computation. So to add to those social and cultural histories of computation, I don't think we should ignore other media, including cinema, but also I mentioned a lot of other examples, right? So I wanted to really actively show what film studies has to offer to the digital humanities. And also I go back to some pioneering forms of multimedia scholarship that now retrospectively we can call them digital humanities scholarships, such as Anne Friedberg and Eric Lawyer's collaboration for the interactive adaptation of her book, The Virtual Window. and the virtual window interactive. That for me was an example of groundbreaking scholarship. So yes, I wanted to provide my own map, and also one methodology that I always advocate is, rather than replacing older methodologies, for instance, the close reading, cultural studies, screen studies, it should be about supplementing and augmenting, right? So of course, distant reading, data text mining, and all these new methodologies are relevant, but I don't think they're ever gonna replace or displace the close reading, the textual analysis. Cultural studies is a big thing for me. So I wanted to endow the digital with more cultural specificity, with more material specificity. So the archival issues are also at the forefront, and the ephemerality and how that impacts historiography and so on. And so far I have received positive feedback from digital humanities scholars, from people in the computational fields and sciences, and so on. So that was my goal, to bring in different people from different areas, and also include the artistic experiments, because art is usually the testing ground for a lot of ideas that are now corporatized, they are monetized, they are all these things. But in addition to the military industrial complex, I would say art is the sandbox where alternative subversions of the other paths emerge through experimentation.
So I have not been to your class, any of your classes, but I have, I think, now I'm like, oh, or did I ever observe you? But I haven't been to your recent classes at NYU. But I looked on your website in preparation for this interview, and it almost seems like classes, seminars are also a sandbox, and that you make interactivity and creativity central. And so I was struck with one example, the example of visualization, where a student baked a cake, which is like a technology that I wouldn't have thought of. But could you maybe give us a sense of your approach to integrating your thinking in the classroom, and then maybe give us an example? And it could be this process of visualization, or it could also be something else.
Yes, so I just put the visualizations in the chat. Can you repeat the last part of the question?
I'm just looking for an example, and it could be the examples of visualization or something else. But I'm just sort of to give us a sense of your, maybe the old-fashioned ways to say teaching philosophy, but it seems so closely tied to your theoretical work and your research area. But then give us an example so that we can imagine what that actually means concretely in the classroom.
Yes, so obviously experimentation and taking risks and thinking outside the box have always been part of my teaching approach. And I make sure that the students have a stake in new assignments when we develop a new collaborative class project, for instance, and so on. I want the students to also be invested in the trial and error and the logistics of a particular project, right? So now I'll mention something recent because I'm in the midst of it. So my students and I are curating physically and virtually. We are working on this curatorial project where we will be curating our CD-ROM emulator collection at the Cinema Studies department. And we are dealing with a very low budget. We are putting together all of our skills to create things like a catalog, like a soundtrack for the experience, a remix, a trailer of the exhibition, and so on. And it's been very challenging delegating different roles. But I like this collective intelligence paradigm where every student has volunteered kind of their strengths. I'm really good at Photoshop. I'm a really good videographer. And now we are dealing with this very elaborate spreadsheet because one of my students' strengths is management and organization. So she created a spreadsheet for all of us to keep us on track. And another thing that has always been part of my approach is DIY. So do it yourself. low tech, if possible, accessible technology, and so on. So now for the curatorial project, my class is going to be challenged again to work with limited resources. How do you go from this ideal vision of this exhibition to something that we have to materialize through very limited means, very low budget? It's going to be partially ad hoc. And the challenge is also to document and mediate ephemeral interactive encounters for both the visitors that are going to be on site at the showcase in the cinema studies department, and then for people that are only going to be able to visit the exhibition virtually. So we are experimenting with new forms of curating ephemeral and highly subjective media, I would say, and at the same time, to increase the investment of the students in this project, I remind them that they're doing very important media archaeological work, media historiographical work. Now, sometimes if you Google a particular interactive example of interactive cinema, some of the first Google results that come up are from student projects or from my websites, right? So when students know about the big picture, I think they become more enthusiastic. They are willing to take risks because I don't have all the logistics figured out, but we figure it out as we go along. And I use the works of former students to inspire current students as well.
Thank you. That's extremely inspiring. We have taken our 30 minutes, and I would actually like to open it up to the audience, and Marina and I can call on people we were told. But we want to invite you either to lift your physical human hand or to use your analog digital stand-in at the reaction. And feel free to ask questions for Marina. Mike.
Hi, yeah, thanks both of you for this conversation. It's been really fascinating. I had a question, whether this is something you dealt with either in your book or in your other work, which is that is, say, you mentioned fan studies, the sort of proliferation of fan recuts of videos. What, you know, with literature used to be fan fiction, but now what we're seeing is sort of that level of interaction after the actual film or video is out. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you've engaged with in your work.
Yeah, so actually, I found that the Let's Plays or the recorded playthroughs for specifically the CD and DVD-ROM collection, they can be a form of preservation. So I have done a lot of screen captures where I go into a CD-ROM and I record my own encounters. So yeah, I approach it kind of like a video game. And then also my students for their media archaeology projects, they have experimented also with different ways of kind of capturing and curating ephemeral media, for instance, video essays, reaction videos, and so on. So fandom practices have been very inspiring to me. Now we are experimenting with doing a kind of trailer mashup for the curatorial project. So I really love those aesthetics because they speak to the DIY ethos also of my work and the book.
Great, thanks.
Allison, and then Marilyn after Allison.
Hi, thank you. This is really, really interesting. I'm not, I'd never actually given much thought to interactive cinema, and just this short conversation is like sparking all kinds of ideas for me. So I'm really grateful for that. And I want to thank you, Marina, for sharing the link to your students' visualizations, because I clicked on this and it's such a kind of striking, like this in itself is an interesting visualization. It's kind of a really striking collage. Could you just give us a little bit? I know there's text at the bottom of this page, but I wonder if you could use this to kind of set up how you approach this subject in the classroom, and maybe a quick summary of the assignment that you would give them that you know has them creating this interesting work. I have another question about smell and taste, if you wanted, because we sort of didn't get around to that. But since other folks have questions too, maybe just first the student work. Thank you.
Yeah, so the visualizations projects are part of a course that I teach called Mind Games in Cinema, and it's on transnational complex forms of storytelling. So mind game cinema, as a genre, as a practice, all those things challenges logocentric interpretation. It challenges text-oriented approaches to film. A lot of the articles we read actually have diagrams for films like Run Lola Run, Memento, Blind Chance, and so on, right? So the visualizations assignment challenges students to come up with their own theories to particular films. It can be one, it can be multiple, and to use other forms of communication besides or beyond text. And that's where we also got the visualization of the cake for Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And it's actually time-based because the student ultimately cut up the cake and there are different layers of the cake. It's a rainbow cake, and it was to talk about the different sensory layers of memory, which was brilliant. So students experiment with so many different media. They play to their strengths, and then they basically create theory, multimodal forms of theory. So I use the term visualizations, even though I challenge students to go beyond the visual. And part of that curiosity was to broaden the term visualizations, because now it seems too co-opted into computational visualizations within the digital humanities, and I don't think that's all it could be. For instance, in my digital humanities class a couple of days ago, we studied W.E.B. Du Bois's pre-computational visualizations, right? So I didn't want to essentialize the visualization as something computational, something data-driven. So how else would you be able to visualize, let's say, film theory and include other modalities and so on? And that goes into territories of unexplored or more Westernly marginalized senses, such as smell and taste. So now that I have the book and there's a whole chapter on the senses and alternative hierarchies, I found that it inspires even more creative work with the different senses. But yeah, I would encourage you to explore the visualizations page, because I'm being very reductive. I'm not going to do justice to the variety of all the creative approaches there. But I will say that, which is part of my teaching approach, those kind of assignments that are more creative, they cater to students of different abilities. So even students that are not the strongest writers, they don't really like to write, cohesive, long essays. They really thrive in these other assignments. So I don't try to push students towards the same kind of outcome for a particular course or for their university career, for instance. So this project-based work, I think, is very useful.
Marilyn Jimenez, you had your hand up, and then I
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, this is very interesting because, I worked within the field of film most of my life, but when I retired, I gave more time to what had become more interesting for me, which is using game engines for making films, exactly. So, and what has interested me a lot is that when you work within a game engine to make a film, you're always somehow awkwardly aware of the fact that there are moments when devices within the game engine that promote interactivity. However, in terms of the larger context of video games today, video game engines are becoming more filmic in the sense that they're developing more, their cutscenes, they're developing, they're moving more heavily into VR and film production, and not developing as much their interactive game component, almost seeming as if they had come to a standstill in terms of development. So there's that tension there. And, for example, you can now you can choose to not play a game, but to see it as a film.
Yes.
And they're not very good, but because they're not, it's not meant to be that. But anyway, that's a movement. So I was wondering, unfortunately, I haven't read your book, but I intend to now. So I was wondering if you had been, you know, have you approached that issue?
The issue of video games becoming more cinematic, or and vice versa.
Video game. Yeah, actually, video games becoming more cinematic seems to be a stronger movement. That video games haven't changed in terms of their interactivity, in terms of what you can do,
Yes.
as much as they have developed their filmic qualities.
Yes, and actually, I want to share in the chat. This is not part of the book, but it's an article I wrote before the book. That is one of my favorite works, I would say, but one of the most frustrating to write, because it came at the time when virtual reality was so overhyped as an empathy machine, as the ultimate form of convergence for cinema, for video games, and so on. And I wanted to change the focus, and so I focus on docu-games, which are documentary games that fuse documentary practices with gaming approaches or gaming mechanisms. So a lot of cinematic video games or gaming forms of cinema. And I wanted to talk more just beyond creativity. I wanted to talk about the documentary potential of gaming engines, for instance, of non-photorealistic virtual reality, and so on, and some of the ethics at stake. So I focus more on how, for instance, video games can convey a form of historical authenticity that is not teleological, is not necessarily fact-based, and so on. So in that article in particular, I picked some controversial docu-games about the Chernobyl disaster and about 9/11. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to say about that, but I didn't want my book to be too into the video game aspect. But I do touch on historical video games, I will say. And that article is much more in depth with that. Yes. And I teach a class. Yes. And just to add to Marilyn, your question, I teach a class that deals in a large part with also autobiographical docu-games that deal with issues like trauma, like loss, and so on. So I think the fact that some video games are becoming more cinematic, I think that could lead to new hybrid genres. Including, I think documentary is something that I'm very interested in, experimental documentary.
Charles Kozla had a question earlier.
Hi.
And Helen, I think. Charles is my student.
Yeah, but he had his hand up earlier, and then I saw Helen's hand.
Yep. Thank you much, Marina, for your talk. So this actually kind of relates to Marilyn's question as well as something Barbara raised earlier. One thing I really appreciated about your book, Interactive Cinema, was how it expanded the definition of cinema. Because for the most part, for most of history, when people thought of cinema, they just thought of seeing a movie in a theater. Where you talk about movies outside the theater space, whether that be CD-ROM gaming, generative AI, or like Manovich-style software cinema. So kind of going off that point, I'd be interested, how do you see how interactive cinema has changed the role of the participant or the spectator?
Yes, I feel like cinema has always been interactive, right? It's just now it's more at the forefront because, of course, in addition to cinema appropriating older forms of cinema, right, like theater, sculpture, painting, music, now we can appropriate from newer forms like video games and augmented reality and so on. So I think it's more, I don't know if it's radically changing the role of the participant as much as it's making us more reflexive of that role, right? And going beyond the binaries of active versus passive spectatorship, right? Because I think those binaries can be very counterproductive, and they've actually really limited theories of spectatorship, of identification, and so on. So yes, and I think it's complicated, I would say, especially when you take into consideration the ambiguity of the ethics of media participation as well, because I didn't want the book to be just about cinema. I didn't want it, as I mentioned before, to be just an academic book. I wanted to use interactive cinema as a springboard for thinking about other forms of social and civic participation, for thinking about different ways we use technology to both transgress and reconfigure certain borders and so on. So ultimately, if you read the conclusion, which is kind of, I always tell people to read the conclusion first. It's like a page or so. But ultimately, the book is not really about cinema. It's more about life. It's about society, culture, politics, and so on. And it's part of my teaching philosophy too. I don't want my students to just learn about film theory and film history. I want them to think beyond that and how that extends into real life and so on.
So we had the hand up of Helen, but I want to announce already that that's the last question. And Marina, if you could make it short, because I do know that the team wants to have the last 5 minutes. So.
Thank you. I have a very simple question, or maybe not so simple, is if you could just amplify a little bit about what you feel are the ambiguous ethics of participatory media. And I don't mean just technology, literally the relationship that, like you said, in life, that people have both with the stories, the screens, the place, the technology, the context.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't know if I can sum it up in like a couple of minutes, but I will say it's definitely a spectrum. It's not either or, good or evil, right? And I will say sometimes participation is kind of reorienting specific modes of citizenship towards areas that don't really matter, right? So for instance, if you're tweeting your opinion, if you are liking somebody's pictures, is that distracting us from other realms where our participation really counts, right? Is it providing a distraction for that? So yeah, now my brain is shutting down because it's such a broad question. But I will say that's why I go into different disciplines and I talk about the role of the audience in specific forms of performance art, for instance, and the role of the voters in particular forms of democracy, right? If we see particular forms of interactive cinema as reflections of democratic mechanisms or as forms of inciting reflection on what is democracy, what is participation, what is majority vote, and so on. So all of those things are reflected and they become more nuanced and more complicated in the book. I also talk about one medium that could be considered participatory within a global expo, for instance. But then if it moves to a totalitarian society, then interactivity actually becomes more ideological, more propaganda, more potentially revolutionary or subversive in dangerous ways, and so on. So I think it really depends on the context, I would say. But also the book reminds us that what we think of as democracy and democratization, I mean, that notion varies so much depending on the context, on how it first originated in ancient Greece and so on. So, and I know I'm not answering the question, but I don't have like a 2-sentence answer to that. I guess you have to read the book.
So I want to thank our two speakers, and what I'd like to do now is to invite everybody to share some takeaways. So I'm going to unspotlight all of us, and I will unspotlight myself after I finish explaining this. And what we like to do is to share takeaways, thoughts that we're going to take away from the event with us. After we share some takeaways, we will move on to our connections and locations post-event social gathering. So I'm going to unspotlight myself and invite folks to share a thought, something they're going to take away from our conversation this evening. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks again for this conversation. I think my takeaway is, I find this very fascinating from a theoretical perspective, but what I really enjoyed hearing about was how you incorporated this into your teaching and into the classroom. And it's really given me some thoughts. I've always avoided sort of creative activities in my film classes, but this has really given me some ideas about really how to empower students and how to get them to engage with cinema a little bit differently through this sort of interactive approach. So thank you.
Who else would like to share a takeaway? Yes, Becky.
Thank you so much. I found the way that you talk about your students and teaching them theory really inspiring, because I also teach a media theory class, and I sometimes struggle with that. And so I know that I'll take away from this conversation the way that you talk about how theory can also be personal and can be experiential. And I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Other takeaways? Yeah, Helen.
You know, the film world is in total crisis right now in terms of production, what the future is really going to hold. So your ideas, your scaffolding of participatory media, I took away from, especially in the classroom, gives the next generation a way out of traditional legacy forms that no longer serve function, neither as a place to find a sustainable career or to actually take any risks. So your work is really important that way because you're reviving people who have taken risks in media and aren't really well known.
Thank you.
And why don't we wrap up the takeaways by asking Barbara and Marina things that occurred to them in the course of the conversation. Their takeaway from the evening.
Marina has to go first.
Oh, well, I'm very happy to see such an interest in the connections between pedagogy, research, and practice, right? Because they used to be very separate, but even to hear the insights and the hope for the future of education and creative practices and so on, it's really very encouraging, I would say.
I think I was so immersed in the book that it's also hard for me to say something new from the discussion. But I guess in the end, it would also be the risk taking and the with the classroom and the collaboration. I think people are really afraid because, and you know that you said that was actually in an answer to a question that you don't have the same outcome expectation for students. I hate to say it, but our institution forces us to define the outcomes now before we teach. You know, so we have to have the outcomes, they have to be the same. Then we have the rubrics of evaluation. And so for me, old school, I'm actually used to the other way. Like you think about the question and the syllabus, and then the outcome happens. And so I find that quite liberating and subversive in institutions to say that maybe you don't need the exact same outcome for every student, you know, because it questions the entire categorization of evaluation. But I find it really interesting because it's not only the students who take the risk, but you also take a risk. And I feel like that also is a way to create trust that, it's not just the students who take risks. So I found that very inspiring too.
Thank you both, Marina and Barbara. I'm going to stop our recording now so we can